Well, finally, to Libya. Okay, this will be a final 2 or 3 questions. Specifically in regards to the U.S. and European-led intervention plan, and what's been happening since, mostly want to talk about President Obama's speech on Monday. He mentioned that intervention to stop the violence was necessary, as he wasn't going to watch mass graves on his watch, which I thought was a pretty solid statement, pretty interesting. Now, I'm not downplaying its importance, but the moral imperative aside, these types of interventions, U.S. interventions in the region, have not worked out well in the U.S. in the past. I mean, the only positive examples that we could say were maybe 1958 in Lebanon and the first Gulf War. And those could be argued other ways as well. You could say both of those were perhaps failures and led to other issues in the region. Given this, I just want to ask your opinion. Do you think that intervention was the right decision for the U.S.?
I mean, this is a tough one, I must say, because you cited some examples. One could cite just one, of course, is the degree to which there seems to be a kind of multinational consensus, that includes Europeans, Arab states, and so on and so forth. And I think that's important because, what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan was unilateral invasion.
Yes.
So this is not that. 2 is, I think there's almost universal distaste, to say the least, of the Gaddafi regime and Gaddafi the man for all that he's done in pretty violent, ways, whether it's killing his own people, starting wars, supporting insurrection, attempting to assassinate the king of Saudi Arabia. So you have certain elements that sort of tilt in favor of a policy like this, especially when one that doesn't involve sending troops and so forth. But these are kind of tactical, if not strategic considerations. And I think your question is even a larger one about the larger question about U.S. intervention as a foreign policy tactic. Is it beneficial? Does it help us? Does it help the people we're supposedly out there supporting? And that's a bit problematic. And what makes it even more problematic is we don't quite know what's going on with the forces that are fighting each other. So my sense is clearly this had a certain political motivation. It was doable in ways that would be politically acceptable. Directed against an individual in a regime that was sort of universally hated. And with the whole and in the afterglow of Tunisia and Egypt.
Absolutely.
So in that context, if that hadn't happened, clearly we wouldn't be in that position. Does it guarantee a successful outcome? Who knows? Who knows? I mean, I don't know anybody who could predict this.
We'll see in the next couple of weeks as far as that goes. One more point from Obama's speech on Libya on Monday, and this will be a final point. He mentioned that obviously America cannot intervene everywhere across the region, where its interests might be jeopardized by intervention. This statement seems to be, in a way, at least in my view, towards Bahrain, pointing towards Bahrain, and the sort of interests that are jeopardized, perhaps doing something there. Thus in this statement, we could say we see a clear U.S. double standard in terms of we can intervene where it doesn't jeopardize the U.S. interest to foster democracy, but we can't where it compromises our strategic alliances. First off, what do you make of this double standard? I mean, a lot of people have talked about it, but then second of all, what are the repercussions of this precarious message throughout the region? Because obviously Obama started his, campaign in the Middle East, when he got elected in Cairo, talking about change, talking about these issues, and we see a clear double standard.
Well, it's the inevitable reality of power over principle. When you're not in position of power, when you're running as a candidate, and you can invoke and stand by certain principles, and everyone is for that. But the reality of international politics, particularly the Middle East, this is so complicated that inevitably something has to be sacrificed. And more often than not, it's the principles that are compromised. Now, interestingly enough, is that until Tunisia and Egypt, no one could really take too seriously, aside from the Palestinian issue, any criticism by Arab governments about our double standards when they're governing over, dictatorships. So, one could sort of put it aside. But now the irony is that as these regimes do democratize, and upon which certain principles of freedom and justice and participation and overall democracy are the foundation, then those principles, will have to be abided by much more closely. It'll be harder to justify these double standards.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're not there yet, but in other words, clearly we're being, it's been made very clear to us that these are double standards.
Mm-hmm.
It's obvious to everyone. And then we can try to justify it in terms of, the national security interests, the strategic and other kinds of interests. But I think as the region becomes more and more democratic, let's assume it does, then I think, that'll be harder to do. On the other hand, it could be argued that once they're all democracies, then you don't need to make the compromise anymore. Yes, you're going to have differences with regimes, but we have differences with our European allies. We've had differences with France for decades on many, many issues. So that I think is part and parcel of how democracies interact with each other, and that shouldn't be the problem. We're not there yet in the Middle East. Thus, you're going to have the weighing of strategic interests, like in the case of Bahrain, as it impacts Saudi Arabia, as it impacts the relation, the status of Iran and its competition with the Saudis.
Mm-hmm.
When all these things come together, the nuclear issue and so on and so forth, then you're weighing so many variables that it's hard to have principles, trump those, and the administration has to accept the accusation of being using double standards of being hypocritical.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gunn. It was a great talk, and we'll only have to see how it develops from here.
Good
Thank
luck.
you so much.